Between the time when the oceans drank Atlantis and the rise of the sons of Arius, there was an age undreamed of. And unto this, Conan, destined to bear the jeweled crown of Aquilonia upon a troubled brow. It is I, his chronicler, who alone can tell thee of his saga. Let me tell you of the days of high adventure.
Hello, once again, dear listeners, and welcome to yet another episode of Conan Chronicles. I am Dan, your host, and the subject of today's review and retrospective is The Pool of the Black One, the sixth Conan story in publication order. This tale was spun by the illustrious Mr. Robert E. Howard and first published in Weird Tales magazine's October 1933 issue. This time, Conan's adventure begins on the high seas aboard a pirate ship. When we meet the barbarian this time, he's been forced to flee from the Baracha Islands, a den of cutthroats and bandits, before the events of the story. While attempting to flee from some unknown peril, Conan had rowed out onto the sea in a leaky boat before noticing a buccaneer vessel off in the distance. The Cybrarian climbs aboard the ship after swimming towards it in shark-infested waters, much to the surprise of the freebooter pirates and their captain, a gloomy, cruel, and lonely thief named Zaporavo. After some introductions, Zaporavo begrudgingly allows Conan to remain on the ship, so long as he earns his keep as one of the crewmates. Conan proves himself to be more than an adequate sailor, quickly earning the respect of his crewmates while they travel the seas. While Conan fraternizes with the rest of the crew, joking, singing, gambling, and drinking between his various duties as a sailor, the one woman on the ship looks on longingly. Long ago, despite his grim and isolated demeanor, Zaporavo had taken a lover. Sancha was once the daughter of petty nobility in the kingdom of Cordova, until the freebooter pirates raided the kingdom, and Zaporavo stole her to be his plaything. After so many years of living amongst these murderers and thieves, the beautiful Sancha had come to enjoy the life of a seafaring adventurer. To Sancha, Conan seemed to be a delightful contrast to her brooding master, strong, humorous, and filled with the vigor of life. While the crew sails towards some lost island that Zaporavo discovered in an ancient tome called the Book of Skelos, Sancha's infatuation with the Cybrarian grows ever larger. After many moons, the ship docks near what Zaporavo believes is the lost island he had been searching for, and the crew disembarks. While most of the crew busies themselves with gorging on fruit they find on the mysterious shores, Zaporavo soldiers on alone, preferring to explore the island in solitude, without, in his view, the intolerable burden of company. Unbeknownst to the pirate captain, a predator among his crew had noticed the captain wandering into the dangerous forest alone.
When Conan saw Zaporavo stalk alone into the woodland, he felt that the chance he had watched for had come. Conan did not underrate his dominance of the crew, but he had not gained the right through battle and foray to challenge the captain to a duel to the death. In these empty seas, there had been no opportunity for him to prove himself according to freebooter law. The crew would stand solidly against him if he attacked the chieftain openly. But he knew that if he killed Zaporavo without their knowledge, the leaderless crew would not be likely to be swayed by loyalty to a dead man. So he followed Zaporavo with sword in hand and eagerness in his heart until he came out onto a level summit, circled with tall trees, between whose trunks he saw the green vistas of the slope melting into the blue distance. In the midst of the glade, Zaporavo, sensing pursuit, turned, hand on hilt. The buccaneer swore.
"Dog, why do you follow me?"
"Are you mad to ask?" laughed Conan, coming swiftly towards his erstwhile chief. His lips smiled, and his blue eyes danced a wild gleam. Zaporavo ripped out his sword with a black curse, and steel clashed against steel as the Barakan came in recklessly and wide open, his blade singing a wheel of blue flame about his head.
The captain, a highly trained swordsman and veteran of 1,000 fights, puts up a valiant defense against his barbaric assassin. But eventually, Conan gets the best of the pirate and stabs him directly through the heart. The barbarian's satisfaction with his victory vanishes quickly, however, when he sees what looks like a giant humanoid, taller than any natural man or woman, with jet black skin, dark as midnight, and fiery golden eyes, striding across the island's landscape in the distance. Tossed over the giant creature's gigantic shoulder is what appears to be one of the crewmen Conan had left to gorge on fruit earlier. His curiosity piqued, Conan follows the giant all the way to the highest summit of the island, where he sees a gleaming city of green walls and towers hidden amongst the emerald hills. The barbarian is able to quietly slip onto a balcony within the city, where he gets a better look at the mysterious creature he had been following, amongst other members of its kind.
These creatures were black and naked, made like men, but the least of them, standing upright, would have towered head and shoulders above the tall pirate. They were rangy rather than massive, but were finely formed, with no suggestion of deformity or abnormality, save their great height was abnormal. Now he was able to make out the creature's details. The superb symmetry of body and limbs was more impressive at close range. Under the ebon skin, long, rounded muscles rippled, and Conan did not doubt that the monster could rend an ordinary man limb from limb. The nails of his fingers provided further weapons, for they were grown like talons of a wild beast. The face was a carven ebony mask. The eyes were tawny, a vibrant gold that glowed and glittered. But the face was inhuman. Each line, each feature was stamped with an evil, evil transcending the mere evil of humanity. The thing was not a human. It could not be. It was a growth of life from the pits of blasphemous creation, a perversion of evolutionary development.
Conan watches on, aghast, as these demonic giants involve his crewmate in some strange, otherworldly ritual.
Conan mentally termed the creatures black men, for lack of a better term. Instinctively he knew these tall, ebony beings were not men, as he understood them. No sound came to him. The blacks nodded and gestured to one another, but they did not seem to speak, vocally at least. One, squatting on his haunches before the cringing boy, held a pipe-like thing in his hands. This he set to his lips and apparently blew, though Conan heard no sound. But the Zingaran youth heard or felt and cringed. He quivered and writhed as if in agony. Irregularity became evident in the twitching of his limbs, which quickly became rhythmic. The twitching became a violent jerking, the jerking regular movements. The youth began to dance as cobras dance by compulsion to the tune of the fakir's fife. There was naught of zest or joyful abandon in that dance. There was indeed abandon that was awful to see, but it was not joyful. It was as if the mute tune of the pipes grasped the boy's inmost soul with salacious fingers and with brutal torture wrung from it every involuntary expression of secret passion. It was a convulsion of obscenity, a spasm of lasciviousness, an exudation of secret hungers framed by compulsion, desire without pleasure, pain matted awfully to lust. It was like watching a soul stripped naked and all its dark and unmentionable secrets laid bare.
After forcing the young man to dance for them, the giant playing the pipe instrument grabs the sailor and plunges him headfirst into a mystical pool of green water, around which all the other giants were gathered to watch. Conan waits for the creatures to leave the site of the ritual before investigating, and recoils in sheer horror when he realizes that the boy had been turned into a miniature stone replica of himself. Conan looks around and discovers a large collection of other miniature stone figures, presumably the fate that befell other unfortunate visitors to this accursed island. The usually unshakable barbarian is frozen in disbelief at this strange and cruel ritual before the sound of a shrieking woman cuts through his fear paralysis. Conan moves quickly to see what the cause of the noise is, and sees one of the giants carrying a shrieking Sancha under its arms. Sancha had spied the barbarian sneak away from his cohorts earlier to follow Zaparavo into the forest, and her infatuation with Conan had led her to follow him. Upon discovering her master's mangled corpse, one of the giants had ambushed her and taken her captive. Conan rushes towards the woman and swiftly disposes of her captor with a swing of his blade. Sancha falls into Conan's arms and tells him that the exotic fruit that the crew had been snacking on earlier had driven them all into a deep slumber. After the crew had fallen asleep, she tells him, they had been taken by the giants to their shining green city, where they now lie unarmed and still asleep. Conan tells her to go and awaken the crew, so that they might help him send these strange creatures back to the hell from which they came. In the meantime, Conan leaps into battle, luring the giants into another part of the city while Sancha does her work.
The jeweled giant rose, taking his pipe from his lips, and at that instant Conan was among the startled blacks with a tigerish bound. And as a tiger leaps and strikes among his prey, Conan leapt and struck. Thrice his blade flickered before any could lift a hand in defense. Then he bounded from among them and raced across the sward. Behind him sprawled 3 black figures, their skulls split. He watched with the calm alertness of a wolf, and when he struck, it was with the devastating suddenness of a thunderbolt, full at the center of the crescent. The giant who barred his way went down, clove into the middle of the breastbone. The dancing recklessness was gone from his eyes. They blazed like blue balefire. His mane bristled, his thin lips snarled. In an instant, the affair had changed from a daring game to a battle of life and death, and Conan's savage nature responded with all the fury of the wild. As the blacks glared in amazement, Conan yelled strickenly and struck them like a razor-edged thunderbolt. They fell like ripe grains beneath his blade.
Just as Conan is about to be overwhelmed by the number and sheer size of his opponents, his groggy crew rushes in to bolster the man who would be their new captain. The pirates are able to kill most of the ebony giants before their leader, the tallest giant among them, adorned with elaborate jewels, casts a wicked spell. The mystical green waters of the ritual pool begin to erupt like a volcano, creating a rushing emerald tsunami that threatens to drown Conan and his companions. The pirates manage to make it back to their ship just before they're swallowed by the rushing tide, and the crew rejoices. The story ends with Conan asking Sancha to kiss him, and laughing greedily about the plunder he knows he and his crew will raid from those who dare to sail in his waters. In contrast with The Slithering Shadow, which was the last story I reviewed on Conan Chronicles, The Pool of the Black One reads exactly like how this, quote, middle period of Conan stories was described by Finn J.D. John in his Conan Complete Weird Tales Omnibus, which is where I'm reading these stories. I spoke a little bit about this in my video on Black Colossus, but John describes this middle period as being of, quote, lesser quality when compared to the prior and later Conan stories. In his foreword to The Slithering Shadow, John says that these middle period stories were churned out by Howard so that he could survive the Great Depression. To this end, Howard acquiesced to any and all demands of his editors, The Weird Tales editors viewed the magazine's brand as a place to read science fiction and horror short stories that played to some specific tropes they thought the readers would enjoy, and by extension, buy more issues of their magazine. According to John, these elements included, quote, ancient ruins, a shapely woman in distress, a supernatural force to defeat, and an ending scene with Conan, arm around the aforementioned woman, loudly and happily looking forward to a future full of open seas and easy plunder. In this story, we do have a supernatural threat, which is a tribe of giants from hell with ebony skin, glowing golden eyes, and talon-like fingernails. We do have some ancient ruins. This is where the giants live and perform this magic ritual that I described earlier, where they turn unsuspecting visitors to their island into shrunken statues. We also have a shapely woman in distress on Conan's arm by the end of the story in Sancha, and Conan ends the story as a newly minted pirate captain, happily boasting of the open seas and easy plunder he hopes are ahead of him and his crew. This is a very formulaic story in that regard. Howard hits all of the tropes necessary to get the story published, and thereby get paid and put food on his table. However, like I spoke of in the Black Colossus review, which is also a pretty formulaic story filled with the tropes described by John in his foreword, this may not necessarily be a negative for all people. The Weird Tales editors were definitely on to something. They weren't completely stupid. Some people do enjoy these genre conventions and tropes when they're done well. It's the reason why, for example, almost every superhero has a colorful costume, and spy genre protagonists like James Bond often employ elaborate gadgets to complete their missions. Playing within these sorts of established genre tropes can be fun. And The Pool of the Black One is a story that plays with the elements imposed on it by editorial, I'd say decently well. This isn't exactly a straightforward story devoid of surprises, like I personally felt like Black Colossus was for most of its page count. Gigantic black ones, their emerald city, and their bizarre ritual that shrinks people down to a miniature stone statue were certainly all creepy elements, and not really what I expected to be lurking on this lost island. Howard's descriptions of these monstrous giants were sufficiently horrifying, I thought, and that shrinking ritual that they do reminded me of a real-world practice of shrinking heads, which is something that's done by groups native to the Amazon jungles in South America. However, I felt that one of the story's greatest weaknesses is that it could have used a bit more fleshing out of these admittedly really interesting concepts. In The Slithering Shadow, Howard gives the reader a truncated history of the city of Zuthal, an explanation of how their society functions, and some backstory on their god that stalks the city's halls. The Pool of the Black One lacks these sort of rich setting and character details that had me absolutely enthralled by The Slithering Shadow. The giants appear to either be entirely mute, communicating through body language, or have the ability to communicate telepathically. They never utter a word throughout the entire story, and how exactly they communicate is left unclear. There are no details about how their society works, or even why they shrink people into small stone replicas when they land on the island. They just have a giant collection of them for unspecified reasons. There's not anything inherently wrong with having mysterious antagonists that the character and the reader alike don't really know much about. However, without more exploration than descriptions of what these giants look like and their creepy ritual, I just didn't think there was really much to the fantastical elements of this one. This story's lore, I guess you'd call it, could have been really interesting, like I found the Tower of the Elephant and the Slithering Shadow's various supernatural elements to be. But without much more, I have to say it did feel a little sparse to me, compared to some of Howard's meatier offerings. The core appeal of this story, I think, again rests on Conan's personality and the Hyborian Age setting Howard places these stories in. The Pool of the Black One does have a fun premise as it relates to Conan, I think. Here we get Conan living as a pirate for the first time. We do see here that Conan is a man suited for the cutthroat life of a buccaneer, as he's willing to murder anyone in cold blood that stands in his way of ascendance to the captain of the freebooters. We see the barbarian murder Zaparavo in this story, A man who gave Conan, then a refugee, a job, a roof over his head, food and drink on his table, etc. It is true that he did this sort of reluctantly, but I think the point remains that Zaporavo could have chosen to cast the waterlogged barbarian back into the shark-infested waters from which he came at the beginning of the story. And we can't forget that Zaporavo is no gloomy saint. He's a ruthless pirate captain, capable of doing things like kidnapping Sancha to take her as a sexual plaything. However, Conan doesn't murder Zaporavo because of this. He doesn't perceive Zaporavo as having some sort of moral failing that needs to be eliminated from the world. Conan drives his blade through the pirate's heart in an act of pure, naked self-interest. The Cybrarian has no problem with the thieving and killing that's a constant in the life of a pirate. He does, however, have a problem with the fact that he's not the leader, and that he doesn't have Sancha for himself. As I've discussed before, Conan is a character that has a streak of moral ambiguity to him, and placing him in this high seas buccaneer setting really allows Howard to bring that to the surface. Conan's personality and barbaric morality, shaped by the harsh conditions of the frozen north, meshes really well with all of the pirate trappings in this story, I think. The Hyborian Age setting also makes this story more enjoyable than it would have been otherwise, I think, because Howard brings a layer of brutal realism to the often romanticized trappings of the sword and sorcery high fantasy genre. This is hardly a story that glorifies the freebooters as a crew of swashbuckling Robin Hoods, stealing from the rich and corrupt. The freebooters are a crew of men who try to beat up Conan as a means of initiation. Their captain is not above taking women as sex slaves. They are all greedy cutthroats who gorge themselves on food and alcohol whenever given the opportunity. I quite liked the portrayal of the pirate's life in this story, because that's kind of how it was in the real world for these people. Pirates of the era that most pirate fiction, I guess, takes place in weren't Jack Sparrows, golden-hearted thieves cracking wise and saving the world in their swashbuckling adventures. Most pirates were actually quite seedy men, willing to murder, pillage, and burn their way to riches. The freebooters are a crew of very seedy people, and this is consistent with Howard's interest in history and the reality of the less fantastical elements in his stories. This sort of detail makes the Hyborian Age feel like a true lost and savage age in humanity's dark past. All of the characters and places described in this story feel molded by the circumstances of such a savage time. Nothing feels like a modern insert or something. It's very authentic. Howard creates this and the rest of the Conan stories with a consistency in setting that, in my view, rivals all of the most cohesive fictional worlds and universes that I've ever seen. Sancha, the damsel in distress character here, is the last thing I'll talk about because, honestly, she feels like a bit of an afterthought to me. Her backstory is potentially interesting. She's a former noble girl, forced into being the sex slave of a pirate captain, who eventually comes to enjoy the lifestyle of a seafaring cutthroat's lover. However, not much is really done with that backstory. She does have one kind of cool scene where she has very mixed feelings after looking at Zaporavo's corpse in the forest, but I thought that some of the women in prior Howard Conan stories I've reviewed here were much more interesting. Yasmela is portrayed as a regal woman with a good head on her shoulders, worthy of Conan's affection, if not a bit out of his league in Black Colossus. Natala from the Slithering Shadow is an ex-slave girl that has insecurity issues when put in direct contrast with the seductress Thalas, who is adorned in luxurious jewels and is as beautiful as even the finest princess of the Hyborian Age. Sancha's personality is kind of that she wants to be with Conan. Most of her internal monologues and actions are driven by this attraction to him, and that desire alone. Sancha isn't this, terrible or unbearable character or anything, but I have to say, she's really just sort of a functional element of the plot in this story. She's only really there because Conan needs a shapely woman to win the affection of by the end of the story, as requested by the Weird Tales editors. To conclude, I'd say that The Pool of the Black One is a very middle of the road in terms of quality Conan story. It's probably my least favorite of the 6 Howard Conan stories I've done a review and retrospective on thus far. But that doesn't mean that there isn't fun to be had here. Conan in a pirate setting is a really fun premise. If you like stories about sailing the high seas, following ancient maps to lost islands, and swashbuckling thieves, I think you may enjoy reading this story. Howard's savage setting and characterization for Conan is just as strong as ever, too, so it's worth checking out if you're a fan of this character and the larger world he exists in, especially given how quick of a read it is. However, I have to say, think that this story lacked in some key areas when compared to the prior Conan stories. I thought that the antagonists and the damsel in distress were a bit underdeveloped when compared to Howard's prior efforts. That lack of greater context for these really cool and creepy things in the story makes them ring a bit more hollow than I'd like them to. The gigantic demon people with jet black skin, glowing golden eyes, and talon fingers is such a cool mental image. I just wish that Howard delivered on the potential of such an interesting group of antagonists with a bit more meaty exploration of what exactly these giants are, what their motivations are, etc. Sancha, in my view, is also the least developed of the damsels in distress we've seen in these stories thus far, and I found that to be a bit disappointing. So, that concludes my review and retrospective on The Pool of the Black One. I hope you enjoyed it, dear listener. I'd like to thank you for watching, and take a few moments to remind you all of some things regarding the show that'll help you experience the Howard Conan tales yourself and support the show if you'd like. First things first, I always like to share with my listeners the gift of free Conan stories, and thankfully, the internet provides. Howard's Conan stories were written in the 1930s, so they're very old. Under U.S. copyright law, this means they have now lost the stringent copyright protection they once enjoyed in earlier decades and have fallen into the public domain. Now that these stories can be used more freely by anyone, many people have either made their own audiobook recordings or ripped older official audiobooks of the Howard Conan stories and uploaded them to YouTube. Most of, if not all of the Howard Conan stuff is freely available in audiobook form on YouTube, which is fantastic. I'll provide a link in the description for the Pool of the Black One audiobook I excerpted in the description below. I personally find audiobooks to be a great alternative, just because my day job requires a lot of reading, so by the time I get home, I'm just not in the mood to do that anymore. I usually listen to these stories while cooking, cleaning, working out, or driving, so for me, there's no more convenient way to experience these stories. If you're anything like me, check out the link in the description. For those who really enjoyed this video, I would also greatly appreciate if you subscribe to the channel, liked the video, and posted your thoughts on this story, my video, or anything Conan in general in the comments below. All of this engagement with the video helps my content get recommended to more people as they surf YouTube. Their algorithm really looks at these things when putting eyes on the millions of videos uploaded here. I'm hoping, of course, to get as many people to watch Conan Chronicles as possible, so that we can not just grow the show, but also the wider Conan fan community in general. Conan is a wonderful character with wide appeal that even some of the most dedicated high fantasy and comic book fans sleep on, I think. So, to that end, let's get some discussion going. I always look forward to hearing from the viewers in the comments. Conan Chronicles is also on Patreon, where you can pledge any amount of money you'd like every month to support the show. Patreon exclusive content will be coming in the very near future, but right now I'm focused on creating these episodes for everyone at the highest level of quality that I can possibly produce them at. So I don't have any extra perks to offer at this very moment, but supporting the show there really helps me out in keeping the show going. Conan Chronicles is also on 3 of the major social media platforms. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, so if you never want to miss an episode, get some cool updates on the show, and see some awesome pieces of Conan artwork, check out those pages. Follow us on all 3, or whichever one is your platform of choice, if you feel so inclined. In the next episode of Conan Chronicles, I'll be doing yet another review and retrospective on Robert E. Howard's Rogues in the House, originally published in 1934 and the 7th story in Conan's publication order. I hope you'll join me for the next adventure, but for now, dear listener, I bid you farewell.
As he came into the waste, the crew thronged about him, Zingarans, all of them, half-naked, their gaudy silk garments splashed with tar, jewels glinting in earrings and dagger hilts. They were eager for the time-honored sport of baiting the stranger. He smiled faintly as he came into the waste and saw the menacing figures pressing truculently about him. He paused and eyed the ring inscrutably, his composure unshaken. There was a certain code about these things. If he had attacked the captain, the whole crew would have been at his throat. But they would give him a fair chance against the one selected to push the brawl. The man chosen for this duty thrust himself forward, a wiry brute with a crimson sash knotted about his head like a turban. His lean chin jutted out, his scarred face was evil beyond belief. He spat in Conan's face and snatched at his own sword. The Barakan's movement was too quick for the eye to follow. His sledge-like fist crunched with a terrible impact against his tormentor's jaw, and the Zingaran catapulted through the air and fell in a crumpled heap by the rail. Conan turned towards the others. The seamen lifted their companion. His broken jaw hung slack, his head lolled unnaturally. "By Mitra, his neck is broken!" Conan laughed and spread his mighty arms as a great cat might stretch itself. "You freebooters are a weak-boned race," laughed the pirate.